This is an introduction to our paper, Professional Perspectives of Youth Justice Policy Implementation, Contextual and Coal-Face Challenges. As an author group, we were very interested in how professionals in the youth justice sector make sense and meaning of policy in the real world, and particularly their lived experiences and lived realities of implementation processes. We felt that policy making as a process had been well covered in youth justice research, but there was far less known about implementation, and particularly kind of the drivers and debates and challenges around how policy is made and understood in the real world, and what the interactions between policymakers and practitioners were. And that was our central object of analysis for this paper. So what we did as an author team, we assembled an author team of critical academics and youth justice key stakeholders, senior representatives from the Youth Justice Board, from YJB Cymru and from the Association of Yacht Managers, all of whom had been chair of those respective organisations. And we invited them to become co-authors and used a sort of co-produced methodology where we would interview the stakeholder professionals on a couple of occasions and take part in an iterative process of discussion and fleshing out, constructing themes around their experiences of policy and practice interactions, and how they perceived their roles, their responsibilities, their occupational cultures, and their experiences within the youth justice system as policymakers and practitioners. So how we structured the paper, we structured it based on Bronfenbrenner's levels of analysis, macro, meso and micro, to help us to understand and analyse two key areas of youth justice policy implementation: the contextual influences on implementation and how these interact with the coal-face practice realities of implementation. So at the macro level, as you'll see in the article, what we analysed was interactions and relationships between different macro-level contexts, so socio-historic, socio-economical, national and local contexts, and how these played out in policy implementation. We found these to be very complex and contested and dynamic, which was not surprising, and similarly how they were influenced by the relationships within and between the stakeholder organisations that were represented by our co-authors. So we started to analyse the influence of relationship between government and YJB, police and yachts, YJB and yachts, yacht managers, yacht practitioners, for example. And inevitably we found that how policy is actualised and implemented in practice is largely dependent on coal-face interactions and relationships. So we moved on to the meso level analysis and found that there was a relational sphere of influence that was really, really important in policy implementation, and how policy prescriptions at a national level were mediated, moderated, overridden and implemented in local authority areas. So we explored the potential for policy practice divide, and also the policy rhetoric practice reality distinction, and found grey areas within both of these, which we explored in detail in the paper, and differences in stakeholder perceptions of these divides and rhetoric and reality distinctions. So, for example, we found that practitioners could tend to perceive that the Youth Justice Board overstated the appropriateness and effectiveness of certain evidence bases, certain approaches, and how easy they would be to implement in practice. We found that because certain evidence bases were poorly understood or perceived as poorly understood, this made it quite difficult for practice to implement them in reality. Found that a corollary of this was that practitioner voices were perceived as being neglected, and some practitioners felt that they had limited input into policy development and practice implementation processes, and found that the YJB was somewhat detached from practice realities at times. But we also found a very constructive relationship, evidence of relational elements between the Youth Justice Board and yachts, which is often omitted from literature from the rhetoric of particular stakeholder groups as well. So we concluded, as you'll read, that macro level pressures interacted with meso level localized pressures to make policy implementation more complex and dynamic than it might initially appear. And then we moved into a micro level analysis and found that there was a potential for differing and disparate professional perspectives on the roles, responsibilities and influence of other organisations, other stakeholder agencies, on the perception of the functionality and the influence of the Youth Justice Board itself, on how marginalised practice views were, on the reasons for and the extent and nature of resistance and reluctance to change, resistance to and reluctance to change amongst practice, and how certain, in inverted commas, innovative practice was perceived by the Youth Justice Board compared to, say, yacht practitioners. But we also again concluded that there had been, particularly recently, an emerging reciprocity in terms of YGB and yacht relationships, the integration of practitioner voices into policy development processes, at least from the perspectives of our representatives. And, or should I say interviewees, we made a point to say that they weren't necessarily representative of their organisation. We concluded by identifying a series of challenges to youth justice policy implementation in the real world. And contextually, there's instabilities that resulted from radical and dynamic legislative change, from socio-economic upheaval such as austerity, from socio-political insecurities, from government and YGB relationships, for example. And these were realised, animated, exacerbated and at the coalface by relational challenges within and between our stakeholder groups, and between our stakeholder groups and external groups such as government, such as local authority. And these had an impact on policy transfer, policy implementation. They had an impact on occupational and organisational identities, how professionals perceive their roles and responsibilities, how they perceive their capacity to exercise discretion, to mitigate policy prescriptions, their willingness to collaborate with other agencies, so their occupational identity more broadly, and their ability to influence policy implementation, I suppose. And all of these challenges sort of coalesce to influence the translation and transfer of policy prescriptions and policy making processes into real world implementation in practice. We conclude that these are shared challenges, however they might be perceived as oppositional or conflicting between stakeholder groups. They're often shared, and that increasingly the Youth Justice Board and yachts and the Association of Yacht Managers see themselves as working together to address these shared challenges to improve policy implementation in the real world. Well, I hope you enjoy the paper, where all of these arguments are fleshed out in much more detail, and we'd be happy to be contacted by anybody interested enough to want to discuss these issues in more detail. Thank you.